Okay, we're live. Hi, I want to welcome you to, this is day 2 of the 20th anniversary celebration of Meridians. I'm a little bit nervous. This panel is A Sense of Shame and Mel-han-choly, Women Who Speak for Themselves. I'm Kimberly Kono, and I teach modern Japanese literature and Japanese language here at Smith College. I'm also on the committee for the Program for the Study of Women and Gender and the Translation Studies concentration. And I'm currently on the Meridians Smith Duke Editorial Advisory Board. So I'm so pleased to be here with our panelists for today. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and then maybe give a little brief summary of their papers, and then we'll jump into our discussion, and then we'll have time at the end for questions from the audience. Okay, so introductions. So Lourdes Torres is Vincent de Paul Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies at DePaul University, where she is also affiliate faculty in Critical Ethnic Studies and Women and Gender Studies. She's the editor of the Journal Latino Studies and the co-series editor of the Global Latino American series of the University of Ohio Press. Her research and teaching interests include sociolinguistics, Spanish in the United States, and queer Latinidades. She's the author of Puerto Rican Discourse, a sociolinguistic study of a New York suburb, and co-editor of Third World Women and the Politics of Feminism, and Tortilleras, Hispanic and the Latina Lesbian Expression. She served as a board member for Amigas Latinas, a nonprofit organization that advocated for the Chicago-based Latina lesbian, bisexual, transgender community, and she's currently working on a history of YEGO, the National Latina, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender organization that ran from 1987 to 2004. And she's also researching Spanish language use in Chicago. So welcome.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Jennifer Cho. Having taken a detour from academia to pursue an alternate career as a chef, Jennifer has, with renewed enthusiasm and clarity, returned to teaching and research. Currently, Jennifer is a lecturer in the English department at the University of California, Berkeley. I did my graduate work there. And she continues to explore transnational expressions of collective grief and racial melancholia in 20th century and contemporary Asian American literature and culture. She's also invested in writing, pedagogy, discovering ways to connect conventional literacies with practices of diversity awareness, empathy, and social advocacy. So welcome. I'm really honored to be moderator of this panel with these 2 thought-provoking essays that are in fields outside of my own. And I was inspired by the ways in which you both approach these different kinds of writing by women of color. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about each of these essays, and I hope that I do justice to this phenomenal work that you both have been doing. Lourdes' 2009 essay, Queering Puerto Rican Women's Narratives, Gaps and Silences in the Memoirs of Antonia Pantoja and Luisita Lopez Torregrosa, explores how these texts negotiate sexuality in relation to race, nationality, and class. In particular, Lourdes highlights the complexity of that negotiation by surfacing the way that shame shapes the articulation of Puerto Rican identity. This essay presents a way of engaging with these memoirs that reads the gaps and silences as a symptom of shame and acknowledges how these writers, quote, queer the space of Puerto Rican women's narratives in multiple ways and around issues beyond sexuality, end quote. Jennifer Cho's 2011 essay, Mel-han-choly as Political Practice in Teresa Hak-kyung Cha's Dictée, explores this experimental text by Cha that incorporates poetry, prose, and photographs and other images. Jennifer discusses how the text presents the trauma of Korean diasporic subjects, a trauma from both Japanese colonialism and the Korean War, and how such subjects are pressured to assimilate, a process that necessitates a forgetting or erasure of that traumatic past. She introduces this concept, Mel-han-choly, which is a hybridization of melancholy and Korean Han, which Jennifer describes as a culturally specific form of grief. This essay then discusses how Cha uses Mel-han-choly as a way to resist the pressures of assimilation and instead, quote, defer historical closure, end quote. So I have so many questions, but I'm just going to start with something sort of fundamental. So in looking back at these essays that you wrote for Meridians, what were the questions that inspired these essays? What sort of precipitated these works?
I'll start. So I think it was interesting looking back, reading it again. I hadn't looked at it in many years, so it was really interesting to go back to it and think about, you know, what inspired the project back then. And I think it was that I had written a paper and had been teaching about Chicana figures like Shuri Moraga and Gloria Ansaldúa. I wrote a piece about their autobiographies, and there's so many Chicana lesbian thinkers that have been out there since the 80s who were dealing with intersexual identities in really profound ways that influenced my own activism and my life. And one of the things I appreciated about them was that they dealt with a lesbian identity. They dealt with a queer identity out front in an open way, embracing that part of them, and advocating for queer people. But I didn't find that in the Puerto Rican writers. As a Puerto Rican woman, I was a Puerto Rican lesbian. I was looking for those texts to speak to that particular experience, and I wasn't finding them. And that's what drew me to texts where I could see there was a presence of that sexuality, queer sexuality, was in the text but was covered. It was an open secret. It was approached in many ways and discussed in kind of a hidden language, which made it clear to queer readers that it was there, but it was not out in the open. And that's what drew me to these particular writers. The people I write about, Antonia Pantoja, was an activist in the 60s. She was a very important educator and political figure who always advocated for children, who dealt with issues of colonialism across Latin America, so she was very active on many fronts, but never sexuality. And I hadn't even known that she was a lesbian until I read her memoir, which is called Memoir of a Visionary. And in it, I read between the lines and understood that she was a lesbian, right? That was news to me. She was a hero to me, but I didn't know that she was a lesbian. So that was shocking and gratifying. And so then I started looking for other texts that did that by Puerto Rican writers. And I also found the memoir of Luisita Lopez Torregrosa, who I knew because she was a journalist for the New York Times. So she was pretty prominent. And I read her, I didn't know anything about her sexuality. I read her memoir and found the same pattern of open secret, of hints and suggestions of queer sexuality, but no direct taking on of that. So that's really what inspired the project. My own desire to find a Puerto Rican lesbian queer presence in the world, in publications, and finding these two texts where the issue of sexuality was kind of again hidden but an open secret, and I was really interested in exploring that dynamic in the work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lourdes, for opening the conversation there. And I'm just so struck by your work. I read your piece prior to our panel today, and there's so many intersections, even if we're speaking of such different experiences and texts as well. But I think, like you, I was drawn to the work that my article or essay covers because of a dearth of representation that I found around Korean American women's experiences. And so when I stumbled upon Dictée, it was a text that really confounded me, puzzled me, because first of all, I had never seen an experience close to mine on the page represented as such. But also because it was such a difficult text to work through. There's nothing really straightforward about it. It's very elliptical and dizzying. And so I think I was invested as far as kind of trying to make sense of it and wanting to make sense of it through the essay. And so I'd say my landing on Dictée and the production of this essay really came out of wanting to understand my own story as it relates to Cha's experience as an immigrant to the U.S., as a daughter of, as somebody coming from a family beset by a history of colonialism and almost kind of double colonialisms, if we're thinking about Japanese colonialism and then sort of the American neo-colonialist project that happens with the Korean War.
Yeah, that's really powerful. This one of the things that really struck me, I'm going out of order of the questions I gave you, but one thing that really struck me was in both of your pieces was the ways in which you opened them up for readers. Like you created this path by which we could meet these works on their own terms. I think, you know, I've tried to read Dictée a number of times and sort of been confounded. It's so experimental. You know, you're confronted with suddenly this like French language text and then this photograph and these things. And it was, and I think in reading your piece, it gave me this desire to re-engage with the text, to really try to get through it in this way, just because of the powerful way in which you were presenting this notion of Mel-han-choly. And then Lourdes, the way in which you were talking about the desire you had to find sort of the queerness or the queering in these two memoirs. I so hear that when I'm teaching Japanese women's writing, the students are like, but this isn't resistance. This isn't the resistance that I want to see in them. And there's a way in which your essay really sort of puts forward this sense that we can't impose those structures upon these texts. We have to go enter the text and sort of follow the text in these ways that allows for them to sort of bring us to that resistance in these different forms that students or that readers might not initially want. Yeah. So anyway, okay, so that was my deviation. But that's one thing I really loved about both of your pieces. Sort of the way in which you opened up to readers. And I think in studying writing and as a literary scholar, I think one of the sort of basic things that I want to do is sort of to introduce these texts to others, to give them access to them, right, in ways that might not initially be evident. So I love the fact that both of those papers do that for us as readers. And so in reading both of your essays, I saw a number of other themes that ran through both of them. The impact of histories of imperialism and colonialism and migration, intergenerational trauma, the effects of assimilation, women's voicing of resistance, and then the multiple valences of silence. So those were a number of different themes that sort of stood out for me. And I'm wondering, as you look back at your essay, which of those themes stand out for you? And if none of those themes stand out for you, what are the themes that you want to put forward for us to talk about today?
Jennifer, you want to start, Jennifer? Oh, you're muted, Jennifer. Yeah.
Oh. Oops. What's happening here? Okay. It's been like a year of Zoom and I still do that. Don't know if the mute is on or off. No, I really appreciate the identification there, Kim, of the shared threads there, because certainly the ways in which silence operates as a mode of resistance in both of, I think, our works is really predominant. And so I wonder, I guess something that I would want to maybe privilege in rereading my article or essay from years ago, 10 years go by so fast, is the interesting ways in which the Mel-han-choly that I've come up with is in some ways informed by the shame that I see Lourdes kind of draw in her understanding of the two works, and how shame itself becomes a way to resist ultimately, like the Nuyorican, the turn and the shift of claiming Nuyorican as once a negative identity into a positive, affirming one, for me was most powerful in your work, I think, in the ways that Cha also claims Mel-han-choly, the thing that kind of prevents her from assimilating as this really powerful source of identification and collective identity.
Yes, that issue of assimilation is interesting for Pantoja, because she was born in Puerto Rico, yet she takes on, I mean, she tried numerous times to move back to Puerto Rico, and she was really identified as Puerto Rican and really wanted to feel that that was her, you know, her home. But she never felt at home in Puerto Rico, because of sexism, because of patriarchy, because of her ability to live her life fully there. And so it's ironic that she took on the identity of a Nuyorican, because it's a stigmatized identity for Puerto Ricans from the island, because it is considered an assimilated, not pure Puerto Rican, right? It's degenerated Puerto Rican for island people, at least back in the 60s when the term was coined. For Nuyorican, for Puerto Ricans from New York, born and raised there, it was an affirmative term, but not from the island. So it's really unheard of for a Puerto Rican from the island to take on the identity of a Nuyorican. And I think that was interesting in the work. But one thing that struck me as I was looking back on it was how, you know, what you mentioned, Kim, that desire that readers have to find themselves or what they're looking for in text. And I thought it was interesting the way that Antonia Pantoja you know, she outed herself partially in this memoir. But then when she died, in one of the in her obituary, in the New York Times, actually, the New York Times acknowledged that she had a lifelong partner, Wilhelmina Perry, and that kind of outed her. And then people started embracing her as a queer icon because she had, in the New York Times, been outed. And then people started embracing that identity more and identifying her as a lesbian. And it's interesting for myself, you know, one thing that came from the essay, I became more interested in her, in Antonia Pantoja. And in Chicago, we had a a legacy project where there's a strip in Lakeview, which is a queer neighborhood, a gay neighborhood, and there's statues with bronze plaques of famous queer people. And so I nominated Antonia Pantoja to have a place on that strip of heroes, and it was chosen. And what happened was that I was, when they did the initiation of the plaque, they invited Wilhelmina Perry, who was Antonia Pantoja's 30-year-old partner for 30 years. They invited her to Chicago, and I got to meet her. And now we're friends. And so that's, for me, the essay is, one of the things I love about it and always think about is that because of that writing, it led me to meet the partner of Antonia Pantoja, Wilhelmina Perry, who is now my friend. She's 87 years old. She lives in New York. And before the pandemic, we'd see each other all the time because my family's from New York. And every time I'd go to visit my family, I would stop and visit her. So in that way, the writing of the essay for me is unforgettable because of the way it drew me into this friendship with Wilhelmina Perry. So that's not literary or academic, but it's really important to me.
But I think that's great. One of the things that that struck me when I was preparing for this is, so Lourdes, when I was reading your essay, you open up with this bridge called My Back, right? And I was just like, oh, I love this bridge called My Back. I was so moved, by the writing by Mitsuye Yamada and Audre Lorde and everybody. And then I was thinking about it, and I was looking at Dictée, and Dictée was republished by Norma Alarcon's publishing company, Third Woman Press, right? Yeah. So there are all these like threads weaving us all together in this way. And I feel like, your essay allowed for this other connection, right? Like that's why we do the work, whether it's the academic, not just for the academic intellectual exercise, but for all of those other things. So
absolutely.
Anyway. Oh, I took us off topic. I do this a lot. I take us off topic. Let's see. I have so many questions. So one of the things I think that struck me in both of your works was this connection between writing and intergenerational trauma and the possibilities of healing, but possibilities of healing without forgetting those histories, right? And the importance of naming those possibilities. And I appreciated the ways in which both of your texts do that. And I wonder if you might talk about the ways that you see healing becoming a possibility through the writing or even through the scholarship.
I would even suggest that Cha's Dictée departs from the sort of conventional narrative of healing in the sense that there's a start and a finish to the problem. Because I think in my article, I try to connect that process to the process of assimilation in the US for Asian Americans, in the sense that you progress as a subject in a way that you forget literally where the history is attached to that movement. And so there's a compulsion, I think, in her work to reconfront the past always. And I see it happening particularly through her pleas for her mother, almost as like a stand-in for the homeland. And I think, Lourdes, you talked too about Pantoja's sort of failed returns to the island. It never sort of becomes a place of resolution in her narrative. And I see that happening too in Cha's work, where she's neither fully assimilated in the US nor fully embraced in Korea when she does return.
Yeah, similar story, right, for a lot of immigrants that,
Right.
that neither here nor there kind of space that we sometimes occupy. Yeah, I don't. For both the writers I wrote about, they don't make. There's not a happy ending. There's not a resolution of that intergenerational trauma. There is a disruption of communication, both from the homeland and from the parents, the actual physical parents. There isn't a healing, and there's and it's not just around sexuality. For Pantoja, it's also about race. And her status as someone who never knew her father, who her father was. So there are all these shames. There's all these things that bring forth shame that actually are never resolved, are just presented and explored, but and often in a veiled way, so that it's you, as a reader, one has to read between the lines to get that story.
But even if it isn't solved, right, it's just the act of naming it, I think, is so powerful, right? Like, as a reader, if you read that and you see it named, you see it articulated, there's a way in which it's suddenly much more concrete. And then you can later somebody else can do the work of doing the healing, right? So that is like such an important step, I think. That's so powerful for both of those works, both of your essays and the works that you're dealing with. I think that was so interesting. I want to go back to something Jennifer said, because you were sort of moving us towards this topic of assimilation. And I kept thinking about, I love the way that you talk about how Cha has us, frames assimilation in this way where it's actually cutting us off from our histories, cutting us off from our past, and that was so powerful to me, because I'm thinking of, it's not just cutting us off from our histories and our past, but it's assimilation cuts us off from each other, right? I kept thinking about, this whole notion of the model minority that's come up, especially recently in talking about sort of the violence in Georgia, right? And the ways in which that Asian Americans are held up as model minorities, and how that is used to divide us from communities of color, right? I think, after sort of in the wake of those murders, I remember thinking there are these protests where people are holding up signs saying "Stop Asian Hate," and I was on, I think it was some social media somewhere. Someone said, "Yes, stop Asian hate against African Americans," right? And it's sort of and I thought, yes, anti-Blackness is a problem in the Asian community, but we all have to start the whole idea of assimilation coming in there and sort of dividing communities, right? And communities sort of buying into anti-Blackness, for example, or was just so, it was so powerful for me then to see sort of the ways in which Cha sort of names the problems with assimilation, like it so gets forward. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially because so much of the model minority myth rests on white privilege, right, or white alignment, which of course would condone any sort of participation in anti-Blackness thought and violence. So it's all kind of imbricated and entangled in this messy knot. And it makes me think too of how, that cutting off of history, or that severing of the past, particularly in the space of Asia, means to kind of forgetting, or I guess not forgetting so much, but confirming the American narrative that their intervention in the Asia Pacific was one of altruism, benevolence, right? It was a rescue mission in a way. So how are immigrants kind of carried into that narrative as rescued subjects in a way where they're not afflicted by their past. They're actually liberated in a way from those histories.
Yeah. Well, and I think like assimilation sort of comes up also in your work, right, Lourdes, in the sense in the ways in which these two writers sort of address, well, have sort of different takes on assimilation. Maybe does that seem right?
I think, Lopez Torregrosa is as someone who's upper class and white, light skinned, is has bought into the assimilation narrative much more, I think, than Pantoja, who's black and has had a whole lifetime of discrimination around a number of issues and is much more critical of colonialism and names it in a way that Lopez Torregrosa, given her background and she was raised going boarding schools, and they're both exiles. They both left Puerto Rico because of their sexuality, but Lopez Grosa is still looking at the world from a kind of upper middle class background. She talks about, for example, when her brother marries a New Yorican, how everyone was really dismayed because they didn't understand how he could hook up with a damaged person, which is how middle upper class Puerto Ricans from the island looked at New Yorkers. So she's much less critical of an assimilation narrative, whereas Pantoja definitely is much more critical of colonialism and other isms in a way that that Torregrosa isn't. So that's different in them.
I think another sort of way to approach your work is to think about sort of, as you both commented, it's been 10 years, a long time. But has your work continued to explore these themes, or have you moved on to other topics? I feel like I'm interested in sort of, since it's been 10 years, what you're doing nowadays.
Jennifer, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I took some time off shortly after the article came out, or in the initial journal. And so I almost feel like, having returned a handful of years later, I'm trying to pick up the pieces again and seeing how grief is sustained to, in a way, discipline, let's say, immigrant bodies, but also how it can be used to mobilize social change and community. So I'd say I'm still working maybe a little outside of the range of Han more specifically, but thinking of how grief is expressed and represented in Asian American experience. I think most recently I'm thinking about Ocean Vuong's novel Unearthed for Briefly Gorgeous, and actually invoking shame as one of the main pieces of the inquiry, as I'm thinking of how Vuong's queerness, in a way, in the text begins to trouble and dismantle the different patriarchies that are represented in the text. So sort of the literal American militaristic patriarchy that intervenes in Vietnam, and then the kind of heteronormative patriarchy in the US, and seeing how those sort of come together. but a lot of it is scrambling to, well, it's just kind of like shaking off the dust of something that's been laying dormant for a while, but I keep coming back to in a way.
That's such a beautiful novel. I love that novel. And the relationship with his mother and his grandmother, that's just so beautifully rendered. That, yeah. I've not working anymore on memoir for a while. I've become more interested in looking at histories of actual organizing around queer issues. And so I've done some work on, now that I'm based in Chicago, I've written some pieces on the history of Latina lesbian organizing moments in the history of Chicago. And right now I'm working on, with my friend Leticia Garcia, starting a history of this queer organization that ran in it's a the only national Latina queer organization that has existed, and it ran from 87 to 94. And so we're interviewing folks who were involved in that effort, and we're writing a book about that organization because we think otherwise it will be forgotten. We're interested in recovering that history and making sure it becomes part of the LGBTQ historiography about organizing in the United States, which tends to ignore people of color. And so we want to make sure those histories are written and shared.
That's great. That's great. So I have more questions though. So Jennifer, this notion of Mel-han-choly, do you see the possibility of it not just Korean and Korean American writers, but I guess it sounds like you see that too in writers of different backgrounds. So in the Ocean Vuong text, you see the possibility of that sort of theoretical concept being useful in approaching his text.
I think so, and especially because the work of other writers have continued to amplify that connection. I mean, most recently, I think of Kathy Hong Park in Minor Feelings, who basically, I mean, it's a rendering of Han to some extent that's not culturally rooted in Korean colonialisms, but more kind of this feeling of, what's the word I'm looking for? Shared collectively across the Asian American community, that we must be models, so we must have no discontents in a way. So, and she herself also offers an entire chapter devoted to dictée, and so she offers definitely a much more current assessment of what that text means, maybe more on a public scale versus this kind of insular academic platform that we're working with.
Yeah.
Do you think it could be applied to? Did you see the film that was nominated for an Academy Award, Minari, which is a retrospective kind of a historical look at his family? Do you think that the concept would apply there? Have you been able to check that out?
I don't think explicitly so. It's funny you mentioned that because I did give a paper on that at the Association of Asian American Studies conference just like 2 weeks ago. Preliminary ideas, but I was most interested in the silences around that potential melancholy in the film. There are like vague references to the war and death and migration and that sort of thing, but very under the surface. But I would definitely want to see if there's a space to think of that without, of course, forcibly, applying it.
I'm seeing that there are questions in the question box, so I'm going to read them. Let's see. So Janetta asks, can vergüenza be translated?
Vergüenza, shame. The way But no, I mean, it's one of those words that you think, oh my goodness, it carries such a weight in Spanish that vergüenza just seems so much heavier than shame does. So it's one of those terms that I think doesn't translate easily.
Mm-hmm. And that goes to a second question by Janetta that I'm just going to read this aloud. Both of you mentioned the issue of translatability, both in terms of language and culture and the texts you analyze, and the experiences of immigration, incorporation, and our assimilation of the writers. Could you speak more about this issue? As an aside, we are publishing an essay about the controversy surrounding the translation of Hong Kong's The Vegetarian in our next issue, 21, forthcoming this June. So I'm especially interested in the question of whether Han can be translated.
I'm so excited for this issue. I can't wait to read it. I mean, I loved the novel, The Vegetarian, but my level of Korean is very minimal. So I did read the translated version, and I did wonder, how much of that is accurate to the original tongue in which it's written. I think Han is one of those troubling conceptions because it does run the risk of essentializing an entire people based on a feeling of shared oppression. So that part of Han worries me because I don't want to say it's, just a Korean thing. It's in our biology. It's determinism at best. But I also think it's super important, right, in terms of understanding and reckoning and remembering those histories that Han seems to get at. So I think there's a necessity to translate the Han, but I don't know if it can be effectively done so to the point where it loses its original meaning.
I think sometimes it's useful to look at translations as different text, right? They're telling a different story. They have a different register, and of accepting them as not copies of one another, but of a different contribution that is related to the original, but not the same product, right? Not the same thing.
Right. Right. And it depends on so many things, right? One of my students here is doing an honors thesis on the Japanese writer Tawada Yoko, who writes in both Japanese and German. And one of the things that Tawada does is she'll either write it in German or write it in Japanese. And when she talks about translating from one language to the other, it's so hard. She says she has such a hard time translating it because the languages themselves have these different, capacities for expression, these different sort of ways of framing something that she has a really hard time moving back and forth between languages in that way. So it's the language too. And so we also have to think, like, if we're translating into English, what does it mean to be translating it into English as opposed to into Spanish or to Japanese? It's that whatever, I don't know what you call that, the destination language that complicates it too. Yeah. Okay. How are we doing for time? We're good. Are there any closing remarks that you all have in terms of thinking about thinking back on Meridians and publishing in Meridians? And
I'm grateful for having had the opportunity. I mean, it was when I found Meridians in the early 2000s, I was just so excited that here was a journal that was intersectional, that was interested in elevating the voices of women of color, that was inclusive of all kind of genres. I learned so much from each of the issues from places all over the world, but always centered on the importance of women's experiences. So when I found the journal, I was very interested in publishing something in it. And so I really worked, to think about what project I could contribute. And I have to say, I've published, I've published some in my life, but I remember the happiness of when I got that acceptance letter from Meridians. It really had such a huge impact on me. I was so happy to be a part of this kind of conversation. So I'm very grateful for that, and I'm very happy to be part of this amazing collection.
Yeah.
I just have to echo everything that Lourdes also mentioned. I'm just super grateful that we took a chance on this essay that came out of my dissertation so many years ago. I was fresh out of graduate school working my first teaching job when I received notice that it was accepted. And not only that, but by a publication that honored women's voices and experiences. So thank you so much. It's incredible to see the direction Meridians is taking.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jennifer and Kim, for this conversation. It's been really interesting, and I didn't know you, but I'm glad to know you now.
Yes, one day we hope to meet you both in person.
Yes, yes, I agree. Yes, I hope I wasn't too scattered. There's so much to talk about.
You're wonderful.
Anyways, I want to thank the audience for attending, and let's see. And so we're finishing up, and so the next panel is at 3:00. The title of the panel is Working the Body, Hair Racing and Cosmopolitan Whiteness. Our panelists will be Janetta Candelario, Ayu Saraswati, and our moderator will be Lucy Moulet. So thank you all for attending, and see you in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.